I'm Jean Tiberio, and I'm a nutritionist and a wellness coach. Welcome to Healing Outside the Box. Today is episode 124, and I'm calling it Compassion and the Burger. Can we have both? I suppose you're thinking that my answer is a flat-out no, but not necessarily. This topic is certainly worthy of a 15-minute discussion on a podcast episode, so I encourage you to stay tuned. I also encourage you to send me your thoughts on my contact page, which is basically healingoutsidethebox.com/contact-us, and I'll also give you a link in the show notes as well. But first, I'd like to tell you about a dream I recently had. I should say first that I had this nasty viral thing with the swollen sinuses, as one tends to get in the winter months in New England. That particular night, I was having night sweats and woke up with my nightgown soaked with sweat all the way up to the wrists. So it doesn't surprise me that I had a fever dream. What surprised me is that my fever dream was about Oprah Winfrey. I was invited to Oprah's house in Chicago to have a special meeting of only women. When I arrived, there were 3 or 4 women already there, and we were all invited to tour the apartment. So already I was feeling pretty special. I sat down in one of her office chairs, and I nearly melted into it. The cushion was so soft, the back support was just right. It was the most comfortable and beautiful chair I've ever sat in. Right now I happen to be in a pretty uncomfortable wheelchair, and I haven't walked in almost 30 years. But it's my fever dream, and I'll walk if I want to. So when I first met Oprah, she gave me this big, wide-open hug. I immediately said to her, "You have the most beautiful and comfortable office chairs I've ever sat in." She replied, "Aren't they?" with that big grin she's famous for. Then we got down to business. There were 5 of us women all together, seated at a round table. That was ordinary by comparison to the chairs. When I summoned up the courage, I asked, "Does anyone know what this meeting is about?" The woman sitting across from me leaned in and said something in a whisper, something that I couldn't hear. She was asking me a question and waiting for my response, but I didn't hear the question. Then the meeting got started, and I was asked my opinion on the subject matter that they were discussing. Because they were all whispering, I didn't know what the subject matter was or how to respond. See point A. And that was the end of my dream. That could have been one of those going to school in your pajamas category of dreams. But I didn't want to disappoint Oprah, and I was pretty embarrassed. Anyway, back to the podcast. I first got this idea for the subject matter when I listened to a podcast by Dan Harris called 10% Happier. This particular episode on his podcast was episode 60, and it was published on February 8th. I highly recommend you give that episode a listen. It's really interesting. So Dan Harris was interviewing a French monk by the name of Matthieu Ricard. The subject matter was his latest book called A Plea for the Animals. By the way, there is also a Huffington Post article reviewing this book, and I'll give you a link in the show notes. Before Dan Harris and Matthieu Ricard got into the book, the 2 of them discussed Matthieu's meditation practice. He talks about what he feels to be 3 basic types of meditation that practitioners use. The first he describes as open awareness, and this is often referred to as mindfulness. He says that we start with a clear blue sky, an open mind, or in some cases a mantra. Then you focus on that, effortlessly as they would say, and thoughts come into your mind, and then you let these thoughts pass and go back to your clear blue sky or your mantra. This results in relaxation, which then allows ideas to come to you effortlessly. The second type of meditation he describes as compassion meditation. This could take the form of guided imagery that perhaps you come up with yourself. For example, imagine a child barefoot and hungry. Feel compassion for that child for say 10 or 15 minutes. then extend that compassion to all children and let that sit with you for a while. Then extend that compassion to all adults. In other words, what he is saying is that there is intention to what your mind is thinking about. The third type of meditation he calls analytic meditation. I suppose you could call this self-examination. An example of this might be a type of self-hypnosis. This might help you in situations such as this. Someone insults you, and it hurts you, and you feel like that person intended to hurt you. That person may be wrong or even cruel, but how you respond to that is critical. He says that it could ruin your day, or eventually it could even ruin your health. Meditation of this nature might help you to see that those words that someone spoke are only words. On a personal note, I occasionally listen to a guided imagery or self-hypnosis tape where they guide me to this beautiful place, say by a lake in the mountains or the ocean's edge, and suggest to me, try to imagine yourself being as healthy as you can possibly be. In this part of the conversation, Matthieu makes the point that suffering in our society can sometimes stem from an exacerbated sense of the self. Example, I want Jimmy Choo's shoes. If I don't get them, I will be unhappy. If I get them, I'll be happy. Then, of course, I get them and I'm not happy, and I can't imagine what went wrong. The bottom line is that a regular meditation practice leads to full relaxation and perhaps an openness of mind. He mentions that the goal of being on the meditation path to happiness is to get rid of selfishness and to actively try to be more compassionate. Then Dan Harris and Matthieu Ricard get into a discussion of his latest book called A Plea for the Animals. Matthieu tells us that each year we kill 60 billion land animals. Many of us have seen these incredibly difficult to watch videos of tortured animals suffocating in small quarters while they are forced to lay with dead animals. On egg farms, all of the male chicks are thrown into a grinder while they are still very much alive. Animals are shown being killed by machines dunking their heads into water and then sending an electrical current through that water. When we see it with our own eyes, it's hard to imagine that we are capable of this type of cruelty. Matthieu tells us that the intention is for us not so much to feel guilty, but perhaps to be uncomfortable enough to want to do something about this. And the animal cruelty he's talking about is primarily on factory farms. So this first issue he brought up was the straight-up cruelty to the animals on these factory farms. This is not necessarily the case on locally owned family farms, and one could certainly argue that carnivores like mountain lions and wolves sometimes take these types of animals in the wild if they are not brought indoors at night. In Massachusetts here, we have fisher cats that really don't resemble cats at all. They are vicious and look more like a mixture of badgers and weasels. They can wipe out a population of chickens in a relatively short span of time. The second issue he writes about in his book has to do with the cost in terms of global warming. In one of my previous episodes, I'll try to find it and give you a link in the show notes, I was discussing this issue both in terms of cutting down the forest in the Amazon and the production of methane gas from cows, which is the second leading cause of global warming. And this CO2 produced by growing the crops to feed the animals, processing them on factory farms in slaughterhouses, and then packaging and shipping all of that meat. If we all cut down on meat consumption to some extent, that would make a tremendous impact on controlling global warming. Now, the third issue he discusses in his book is also about compassion. I was told this back in '76 when I took one of my first nutrition classes. It's an understatement to suggest that the problem has gotten worse. And the issue is this. we could feed every man, woman, and child on Earth, even though there is nearly 7 billion of us now, with all of the corn and soy grown to feed livestock. We even ship corn to Europe to feed their cattle. If someone ran the numbers, and perhaps someone has, we would find that we feed more to their cattle than to Syrian refugees. Matthieu acknowledges that in some societies, such as Eskimos and the Tibetans that live at 12,000 feet above sea level, there is little or no farming. These people have to rely on primarily a meat-based diet. But places like India feed about 800 million people with little animal protein. Certainly most of us in industrialized nations can follow India's lead and eat more legumes. And many tropical countries rely on lots of nuts and seeds. Most of those blue zone populations eat a lot of nuts, seeds, legumes, and root vegetables. I have a Blue Zone podcast episode I'll put up in the show notes. This reminds me of another story. I was wheeling down the pier at Salem Willows, only about a mile and a half from where I live. At the end of the pier, which extended very far out into the ocean, I met a couple of guys who were fishing. We were shooting the breeze, chit-chatting, etc., and one of them caught what appeared to be a large sea bass with a single fishing pole. He pulled up the bass and held it out in his hands. The two of them immediately started discussing how long it was, and the fisherman said, "I think it's only 18 inches long. I'll need to throw it back." I asked, "Isn't that a big enough fish to take home for dinner?" Which is what he was planning to do. Now, in my mind, I was thinking that there were no policemen to handcuff him, put him in the back of a paddy wagon, and deport him. No one would care if he took that bass home and ate it for supper with a little olive oil, lemon juice, perhaps some thyme. But without hesitation, he threw it back, and the bass just swam away. So I was watching a man who felt the moral responsibility to respect wildlife because the rule was that the fish had to be 21 inches long to take it home for supper. It occurred to me that this is what Matthieu was talking about. Now, I'm paraphrasing here, but this is his general message. If you care for your family, that's great. If you care for all children, you are compassionate. If you care for all creatures on our planet, you have global compassion. I'll end with a quote from Jane Goodall from the back of his book. By the way, I've only skimmed the surface in this episode, and I recommend that you get the book. Once again, it's called A Plea for the Animals. Here's the quote. "Are animals mere things here for us to exploit? Or are they rather sentient, often intelligent beings, entitled to their own lives?" Matthieu Ricard examines the theological, philosophical, and scientific thinking on both sides of this issue, and concludes that without a doubt, we must recognize each animal as an individual deserving of our compassion and respect. A Plea for the Animals is fascinating, instructive, and compelling, speaking to all of us on both an intellectual and emotional level. Here is another quote from Matthieu Ricard. "Benevolence is not a commodity that needs to be distributed sparingly, like cake or chocolate. It is a way of being, an attitude, an intention to do good for those who enter a sphere of attention, in the wish to alleviate their suffering. Loving animals does not mean loving humans less. In fact, by also loving animals, we love people better, because our benevolence is then vaster and therefore of better quality." That's all I have for you today. Be well and stay tuned next week for another episode of Healing Outside the Box.